Let's talk through the whole process of working through a school and with a group of teachers on moving teaching and learning forward.
Clearly there's quite a lot of time involved either working with a whole staff and presenting issues, doing very specific training on learning objectives, on how to weave in learning outcomes with that, on questioning techniques, on active learning techniques. And really those are the tools that we then want to work with teachers on in a very practical way in classrooms. So here's a typical rundown of how we might work in two particular ways. If we're working at whole school level, and what we're doing is actually working to develop the skills of teachers at different levels in observation, we would go into a lesson with somebody. Typically it might be a senior manager, but quite often we also observe with somebody who's finding it difficult to move on and difficult to develop the areas for improvement, because by going into a classroom and going through this process with us, they tend to get it virtually immediately, and we do an awful lot of that work. So if we're observing with somebody else, what we'd be doing is going into the classroom. We don't use a tick list or a checklist, as we've already explained. If you do that, and lots of schools have them, all you tend to be doing is looking for the things to tick off in the lesson, and you miss an awful lot of other things. The best description of what we do is to act as a human camera. A camera doesn't lie, it records faithfully what it sees, and that's what we do. We typically write down a simple narrative of what we're seeing unrolling in the classroom, and we don't miss anything. We look at students extensively, we focus on students, record what they're doing, record how they're reacting to what the teacher's providing for them, the clarity of the objectives, etc., etc., the clarity of the questioning. We'll also look at the teacher's role, whether they're talking too much, whether they're asking the right questions, whether they're going around evaluating and assessing how students are progressing as the students are working on their own. And most of all, we talk to students. It's not possible in every lesson. You have to use your judgment about when the appropriate time is so you don't interrupt the flow of the lesson. But most of our information about progress comes from students themselves. And we have a series of questions that we ask and we work through with co-observers. We teach people to be natural with students and not inspectorial, the same with teachers. So you might go up to students and say, "Here, I missed the start of the lesson. Just talk me through what you've been doing so far." "Well, that's interesting. Can you give me two things that you've learned and made progress on in the last 15 minutes that you didn't know at the beginning of the lesson?" And that starts a conversation off. The students will be delighted to show you in their books, delighted to talk through what they're doing. And in that way, you're building up a repertoire, all of it focused on student progress. Typically, we tend to come out of a lesson after a period of time. It might be about halfway through the lesson, so we can have a discussion with our co-observer about what we've seen. At that stage, we then introduce the notion of professional judgment. So we haven't used any set criteria so far. What we say to the teacher who we're observing with is, don't express a personal opinion about what you're seeing. Nobody's interested in your personal opinion. What they're interested in is an evidential-based look at progress and learning. What's the evidence for progress? What have you seen? So the first question to the teacher we're observing with, or the senior manager, is, okay, professional judgment time. You're not allowed to sit on the fence. You're not allowed to say, well, it might be this or it might be that. What's the judgment linked to the Ofsted criteria on this lesson? And then we substantiate it. It's our own so what factor, if you like, so that actually each of us then says, well, actually, this is why I've reached that decision. It's based on this. Here's the evidence that we saw in the lesson. And we then discuss how the lesson could be made better, how it could be improved in relation to student learning and progress. And that's the same with any lesson. It would be the same if we'd seen a lesson we've judged inadequate. How do we move it on? Requires improvement covers a vast spectrum of practice. At the bottom end, it could be verging on inadequate. At the top end, it could be verging on good, with many aspects of good. And then we identify 3 or 4, sometimes more, sometimes less areas, even in an outstanding lesson, which would embed the good or outstanding nature of the lesson further and move it forward.
Okay, so that's you and the observer have now reached a judgment on the lesson. How does the classroom teacher get involved?
We don't always observe with other people. Sometimes we're on our own, and therefore that then keys up the issue of feedback. We tend not to do feedbacks anymore. We have professional discussions with teachers after a lesson, and there's a significant difference between the two. One of them tends to be someone who's seen a lesson who says, this is what I saw, this is my judgment on it, and here's some things to do to improve it. Whereas a professional discussion is, what are each of our viewpoints of the lesson? The teacher who's taught the lesson will know how it's gone, except we will have seen far more than they see. We also know that we make a difference being in there, and we discuss that with the teacher and discuss the nuances of what we've seen compared with what they've seen. We then develop a self-evaluative process with the teacher where they're actually saying, well, yes, I could have done this. Often they'll say, if you'd stayed till the end, you would have seen this. And we'll say, well, yeah, that's fine. If we've had a plan for the lesson or a set of PowerPoint slides for a lesson, that helps with the decision. We can see what was intended. And of course, they can tell us how, from their point of view, the lesson went when we weren't there. And we then discuss what might make the lesson better, and we give them a judgment. Sometimes teachers disagree about the judgment, and we've had many robust discussions with teachers about the difference between their view of the lesson and ours. What we tend to do is not say, this is our judgment and it sticks. What we say is, well, you're perfectly entitled to your judgment on the lesson, but can we look a bit further at how we can look at these particular issues of it, and let's discuss this again and look in detail at how we can implement those in the lesson.
Where's it going to develop next, do you think?
I think the next stage of this is to work with teachers to get a much more sophisticated planning process for lessons. Two important things. One is that there's no such thing as a model ideal lesson. Ofsted don't have one, we don't have one. A perfect lesson is one which delivers the right outcomes and outstanding learning outcomes for students. So what we'd like to do is make that process more and more sophisticated, get teachers and students themselves more and more comfortable and sophisticated from their own point of view about managing the process. Part of it might involve a more significant look at short and medium term planning, setting lessons in terms of progress in the context of schemes of work, in the context of syllabuses for examinations and so on. There are constantly ways of looking at improving what we're doing, and that's the whole basis of how we operate with schools.